There's a particular question that lingers for almost everyone who has loved a dismissive avoidant partner, one that tends to surface quietly, months or years after any specific relationship has ended. A genuine curiosity about what actually happens to someone whose entire relational strategy is built around minimizing connection, deflecting vulnerability, and maintaining distance as a form of protection. It's easy to imagine, from the outside, that this strategy might simply continue working indefinitely, that a dismissive avoidant might genuinely succeed at avoiding the discomfort of closeness for their entire life, insulated from whatever consequences their pattern might otherwise produce. The actual trajectory tends to look considerably different from this assumption, and understanding what typically unfolds over a dismissive avoidance longer life course offers real clarity to anyone still trying to make sense of what they experienced. If the listener has wondered what eventually becomes of a dismissive avoidant partner, whether their strategy of maintaining distance actually serves them well across an entire lifetime, or whether it produces consequences that only become visible much later, this exploration is going to trace the typical trajectory this pattern follows, from its earliest, most successful stages through to where it usually leads by the time significant time has passed. To understand this trajectory, it helps to understand why dismissive avoidance often appears successful, even admirable, during its earlier stages. Dismissive avoidants typically present as remarkably capable, self-sufficient, and unbothered, qualities that read, in many social and professional contexts, as genuine strength rather than defense. This presentation often produces real, tangible success, career achievement built on self-reliance, an ability to remain calm under pressure that colleagues and friends genuinely admire, a kind of composed independence that many people actively envy. During this earlier period, often spanning young adulthood and into midlife, dismissive avoidance can look, from almost every external vantage point, like a genuinely effective strategy for navigating life. This is worth naming directly because it explains why so many people initially find dismissive avoidants compelling partners, drawn to exactly the qualities that will later produce so much relational difficulty. The same self-sufficiency that makes someone appear confident and stable also makes genuine intimacy considerably harder to access, but this cost remains largely invisible during the relationship's earlier stages, when novelty and mutual attraction can mask the underlying pattern for considerable time before its effects become fully apparent. It's worth exploring what begins shifting as a dismissive avoidant moves further into adulthood, because the strategy that worked reasonably well during earlier life stages tends to produce increasingly visible costs as time accumulates. Relationships end repeatedly, following remarkably similar patterns each time. A partner drawn in by the avoidant's composed independence, followed by growing frustration as genuine intimacy proves elusive, followed eventually by the relationship's ending, sometimes initiated by the avoidant themselves, sometimes by an exhausted partner who has finally stopped waiting for closeness that never fully materializes. This pattern, repeated across multiple relationships, begins accumulating its own kind of evidence the dismissive avoidant can increasingly struggle to explain away through situational factors alone. There's something worth naming about how this accumulation typically gets processed, at least initially, because dismissive avoidants tend to be skilled at constructing narratives that protect them from confronting the pattern directly. Each individual relationship's ending gets attributed to specific external circumstances: incompatibility, poor timing, a partner who was somehow too demanding or too emotional, rather than to any consistent pattern in the avoidant's own behavior across multiple relationships. This narrative construction can persist for a remarkably long time, sometimes extending across an entire string of relationships spanning decades, each one explained away individually rather than examined collectively for the pattern they actually represent. It's worth examining what eventually disrupts this protective narrative construction, because it rarely dissolves through simple accumulation of evidence alone. Something more specific typically needs to happen, a particular relationship's ending that proves harder to explain away than previous ones, direct feedback from someone whose opinion the avoidant genuinely respects, or simply enough repetition that even sophisticated narrative construction eventually strains under the weight of an undeniable recurring pattern. When this disruption finally occurs, it tends to produce exactly the kind of breaking point explored elsewhere, a genuine, if often painfully delayed, confrontation with the reality that their own patterns, not external circumstance, have been the consistent variable across every failed relationship. There's a particular trajectory worth naming regarding what tends to happen to a dismissive avoidance social world as this pattern continues across decades without being adequately addressed. Romantic relationships aren't typically the only casualty. Friendships often follow a similar, if somewhat slower, arc, close connections that never quite deepen into genuine intimacy. Friends who eventually drift away after years of encountering the same emotional unavailability that romantic partners experience more intensely. Family relationships, particularly with anyone attempting genuine closeness, often follow this pattern too. Adult children sometimes reporting a persistent sense of never quite having been fully known by a dismissive, avoidant parent, despite that parent's genuine presence and practical involvement throughout their upbringing. It's worth exploring what this cumulative social erosion typically produces by the time a dismissive avoidant reaches later midlife or older adulthood, because the isolation that results deserves careful, honest examination rather than either exaggeration or minimization. Many dismissive avoidants do maintain some meaningful connections throughout their lives, family relationships that persist despite their limitations, occasional friendships that survive because both parties have adjusted their expectations accordingly. What tends to diminish more significantly is the depth and reliability of genuine intimate support, the kind of connection someone can turn to during genuine crisis, illness, loss, the difficulties that inevitably arrive later in life and that require exactly the vulnerability dismissive avoidance was originally built to avoid. There's something worth naming about how this deficit becomes particularly apparent during specific life transitions that most people navigate with substantial support from close relationships. Retirement, for instance, often strips away the professional structure and achievement that had previously provided dismissive avoidance with a genuine, if partial, source of identity and validation, leaving considerably more unstructured time that, without close relationships to fill it, can produce a specific, disorienting kind of loneliness many dismissive avoidants haven't previously had to confront directly. Health difficulties, similarly, tend to expose the limitations of a life built primarily around self-sufficiency, illness, and aging, frequently requiring exactly the kind of sustained support and vulnerability that dismissive avoidance has spent decades avoiding. It's worth examining what happens when these later life circumstances finally force the confrontation that earlier life stages had allowed the dismissive avoidant to successfully postpone. Some respond to this forced confrontation with genuine, if considerably delayed, growth, finally engaging with therapy or deliberate relationship repair during a life stage when the cost of continued avoidance has become undeniable rather than merely theoretical. This late-stage growth, while genuinely possible and worth acknowledging honestly, typically proves considerably more difficult than growth pursued earlier in life, both because ingrained patterns become harder to shift after decades of reinforcement and because there's simply less remaining time and opportunity to rebuild the kind of deep, trusting relationships that earlier growth might have preserved or developed. There's a particular trajectory worth naming for dismissive avoidants who don't manage this late-stage reckoning, who instead continue the same patterns into older adulthood without ever fully confronting their cumulative cost. This path often leads toward a specific, genuinely difficult kind of isolation, technically surrounded by some family or acquaintances, but genuinely known by almost no one, having successfully protected themselves from vulnerability at the cost of the deep companionship that typically sustains people through life's most difficult later stages. This outcome deserves honest, direct naming, not to produce fear or moralize about the dismissive, avoidant pattern, but because understanding this genuine, common trajectory offers important context for anyone currently loving a dismissive, avoidant partner and wondering whether patience might eventually produce different results. It's worth exploring what factors most reliably distinguish dismissive avoidants who eventually achieve genuine growth from those who don't, because this distinction matters considerably for understanding the actual range of possible outcomes, rather than assuming either universal doom or universal eventual redemption. Those who successfully shift the pattern typically share several common factors: genuine engagement with therapy, specifically addressing attachment patterns rather than surface-level symptom management, at least one relationship, romantic or otherwise, that models sustained patience without either enabling continued avoidance or abandoning the connection entirely, and some specific triggering event, often occurring in midlife rather than earlier, significant enough to disrupt the protective narrative construction that had previously allowed the pattern to continue unexamined. There's something worth naming about how the presence or absence of children specifically affects this trajectory, because parenting sometimes functions as one of the more powerful catalysts for genuine change among dismissive avoidants, precisely because it introduces a relationship that cannot be easily distanced from or abandoned the way romantic partnerships and even friendships sometimes can be. Watching their own children struggle with the same emotional distance they experienced growing up, if the avoidant's own parent displayed similar patterns, sometimes produces a specific, powerful motivation to interrupt an intergenerational cycle that romantic relationship difficulty alone hadn't managed to disrupt as effectively. For the listener currently loving a dismissive avoidant partner, wondering which trajectory their specific relationship is more likely heading toward, there's something worth naming honestly about the limits of prediction here. No single factor guarantees which path any specific dismissive avoidant will ultimately follow, and patience alone, however genuinely offered, cannot reliably determine the outcome, because the actual determining factors involve considerable internal work that only the avoidant themselves can ultimately choose to pursue or avoid. What patience can offer, when it's offered from a place of genuine self-respect and appropriate boundaries, rather than desperate, indefinite waiting, is space for growth to occur if the avoidant genuinely chooses to pursue it, without guaranteeing that this choice will actually be made. There's a specific dimension worth exploring here concerning how this trajectory typically unfolds across professional life specifically, because career outcomes for dismissive avoidance often follow a pattern worth understanding in its own right, separate from but related to the relational trajectory this exploration has traced throughout. Dismissive avoidants frequently excel during earlier career stages. Their capacity for independent work, emotional composure under pressure, and comfort with autonomy translating into genuine professional advantage in many work environments. This advantage often continues considerably longer than the relational advantages described earlier, because professional success doesn't require the same depth of sustained vulnerability that genuine, intimate relationships eventually demand. However, as careers progress into leadership positions requiring genuine collaborative trust, mentorship, and the kind of authentic connection that effective team leadership typically requires, many dismissive avoidants encounter a professional ceiling that mirrors, in structure if not in intensity, the relational ceiling they've encountered elsewhere. Colleagues and direct reports sensing the same emotional distance that romantic partners have long since identified, limiting the depth of professional trust and collaboration available to them, despite considerable technical competence. It's worth examining how this professional trajectory interacts with the broader pattern of accumulating isolation discussed throughout this exploration, because career achievement, however genuine, often cannot substitute for the kind of deep personal connection that dismissive avoidance has systematically limited across other domains. Many dismissive avoidants reach considerable professional success by midlife, while simultaneously experiencing the relational isolation this exploration has traced, creating a specific, often disorienting combination: genuine external validation and achievement coexisting with genuine internal loneliness that achievement alone cannot resolve. This combination sometimes produces exactly the kind of confusion that delays the eventual breaking point discussed elsewhere, because professional success can function as evidence, at least temporarily, that the avoidance overall life strategy is working, obscuring the more specific relational costs this pattern has been quietly accumulating. There's something worth naming about how this trajectory typically affects a dismissive avoidant's physical health across their lifespan, because the chronic stress associated with maintaining emotional distance and the corresponding lack of the social support that typically buffers against health difficulties produces measurable, documented consequences worth understanding honestly. Research on social isolation and its relationship to physical health outcomes consistently suggests that people lacking close, reliable social support face measurably worse outcomes across numerous health domains, from cardiovascular health to immune function to overall longevity, compared to people with genuine, sustained, close relationships. While not every dismissive avoidant experiences significant isolation, and while genetics and countless other factors also shape health outcomes considerably, the pattern of accumulating relational thinness this exploration has traced does correlate, at a population level, with exactly the kind of isolation that tends to produce worse long-term health trajectories. It's worth exploring too how this trajectory sometimes gets interrupted or redirected by specific relationships that manage to persist despite the dismissive avoidance usual pattern. Because not every relationship in a dismissive avoidance life follows the pattern of eventual ending this exploration has primarily traced. Some relationships, often ones where the other partner has developed their own considerable capacity for secure, non-anxious presence, manage to persist across decades despite the avoidant's continued difficulty with full emotional openness. These relationships typically don't achieve the depth of intimacy that securely attached partnerships more readily develop, but they can provide a meaningful, if limited, form of companionship that partially offsets the more severe isolation this exploration has described for dismissive avoidants whose relationships consistently end rather than persisting in this more limited form. There's a particular consideration worth naming about how this trajectory differs for dismissive avoidants who eventually experience significant loss, the death of a parent, a sibling, or another close family member, because these losses sometimes function as unusually powerful catalysts for the kind of reckoning this exploration has described elsewhere as typically requiring some specific triggering event. Confronting mortality directly through the loss of someone genuinely close, despite the dismissive avoidance usual patterns, sometimes produces a kind of clarity about the cost of continued emotional distance that gradual relationship endings, however numerous, hadn't previously managed to produce as effectively. This specific pathway toward eventual growth deserves recognition alongside the others this exploration has named, because grief, unlike ordinary relational disappointment, tends to strip away exactly the kind of protective narrative construction dismissive avoidance typically relies on to remain unexamined. It's worth examining as well how this trajectory intersects with broader questions about how dismissive avoidance gets perceived and understood across different cultural contexts, because not every culture values and rewards the specific presentation of self-sufficiency and emotional composure that makes dismissive avoidance appear successful during its earlier stages. In many Western individualist contexts, cultures placing greater emphasis on collective interdependence, extended family obligation, and communal support structures sometimes provide less initial reward for dismissive avoidant presentation, meaning the eventual costs this exploration has traced may become apparent considerably earlier in life within these contexts, precisely because the social structures surrounding the avoidant provide fewer opportunities for isolation to remain comfortable or unexamined for as long as more individualist contexts typically allow. There's something worth naming about how gender shapes this trajectory in ways worth understanding honestly, because dismissive avoidance, while present across all genders, sometimes gets interpreted and rewarded differently depending on gendered expectations around emotional expression and self-sufficiency. Men displaying dismissive avoidant patterns sometimes receive more consistent social reinforcement for this presentation throughout earlier life stages, cultural narratives around masculine stoicism, and independence providing additional cover for patterns that might otherwise face more direct challenge or feedback. Women displaying similar patterns sometimes face more immediate social pushback, cultural expectations around feminine emotional availability, creating friction with dismissive, avoidant behavior considerably earlier than many men with similar patterns typically encounter. This gendered variation doesn't change the underlying trajectory this exploration has traced, but it does shape its timing and visibility in ways worth understanding for a complete picture of how this pattern typically unfolds. It's worth naming too how this trajectory sometimes shifts once a dismissive avoidant becomes a grandparent, an often overlooked life transition that deserves separate consideration from the parenting dynamics discussed earlier. Some dismissive avoidants find that grandparenthood, occurring with less direct daily responsibility and less of the sustained pressure that raising their own children once required, provides a somewhat safer context for genuine warmth and connection than they managed to offer earlier in life. This doesn't represent full resolution of the underlying pattern, but it sometimes offers a meaningful, if partial, opportunity for expressing care more freely. Precisely because grandparenting typically involves less of the sustained daily vulnerability that closer, more demanding relationships require. Recognizing this possibility matters for adult children of dismissive, avoidant parents who might notice, with some genuine surprise, a grandparent displaying more warmth toward grandchildren than that same person ever managed to offer during the adult child's own upbringing. There's a particular pattern worth exploring regarding how this trajectory interacts with an avoidance relationship to their own physical mortality as they age, because confronting genuine, unavoidable mortality, rather than the more abstract mortality awareness that earlier life stages typically involve, sometimes produces one of the more significant catalysts for late life change this exploration has traced throughout. Facing a genuine terminal diagnosis, or simply the accumulating physical realities of advanced age that make continued postponement of emotional reckoning increasingly untenable, sometimes strips away decades of protective narrative construction with unusual speed and finality. Some dismissive avoidants use this final period for genuine, if considerably delayed, connection and repair, finally offering family members the vulnerability and presence that decades of relationship had previously lacked. Others continue the same patterns until the very end, dying with the same emotional distance that characterized their entire adult life, a genuinely difficult outcome worth naming honestly, rather than assuming universal late life redemption occurs for everyone following this trajectory. It's worth examining as well how family members, particularly adult children, typically process this entire trajectory once it becomes fully visible across a dismissive avoidant parent's complete life course. Many adult children report a specific, complicated grief process regarding a dismissive avoidant parent, grieving not just eventual death, but the entire lifetime of limited emotional connection that preceded it. Sometimes processing this grief more intensely after the parent's death than they were able to while the parent remained alive, and the relationship, however limited, still technically continued. This delayed grief deserves recognition as its own distinct experience, separate from, but related to, the romantic partner's experience this exploration has primarily focused on throughout, extending the pattern's costs across an entire family system, rather than limiting them to romantic relationships alone. There's something worth naming about how this broader trajectory connects to intergenerational patterns worth understanding across multiple generations, rather than simply within one dismissive, avoidant individual's single lifetime. Dismissive avoidance frequently traces back through family lines, a dismissive avoidant parent having been raised by their own emotionally distant caregiver, that caregiver having experienced similar patterns in their own upbringing, extending backward through generations in ways that can feel, to anyone trying to understand a specific family's dynamics, considerably larger and more entrenched than any single person's individual choices or failures. Understanding this intergenerational context doesn't excuse any specific dismissive avoidance behaviour, but it does offer useful context for why certain patterns prove so remarkably persistent and so difficult to interrupt without genuine, deliberate intervention across at least one generation, willing to do the harder work of breaking the cycle. It's worth exploring, finally, what this entire understanding of the dismissive avoidant's typical lifetime trajectory offers someone currently deciding how much of their own life and emotional energy to invest in a relationship with a dismissive avoidant partner, whether romantic, familial, or otherwise. This understanding doesn't provide a simple formula for predicting any specific individual's future path with certainty, but it does offer something valuable, a realistic framework for weighing patience against self-protection, understanding both the genuine possibility of eventual growth and the genuine likelihood that this growth, if it happens at all, may arrive considerably later than would benefit any specific current relationship, sometimes only after decades of accumulated cost that a current partner or family member has no obligation to personally absorb, while waiting to see which outcome ultimately unfolds. There's a final consideration worth naming about what this understanding means for the dismissive avoidants themselves, who might eventually encounter this exploration and recognize their own patterns within it. Nothing about this trajectory is inevitable in the deterministic sense that might suggest genuine change remains impossible regardless of effort. The trajectory described throughout represents a statistical tendency, a common pattern observed across many dismissive avoidant lives, not an unavoidable fate that removes individual agency or responsibility. Genuine, sustained work, ideally begun earlier rather than later, meaningfully shifts the odds toward the growth pathway rather than the accumulating isolation pathway this exploration has traced in more detail. Recognizing this pattern early, rather than waiting for the kind of forced, late-life reckoning this exploration has described as common, represents perhaps the single most valuable intervention available to anyone who recognizes these patterns clearly enough in themselves to genuinely want something different for the remainder of their own life. Understanding this broader pattern offers something valuable beyond simple prediction of any single person's future. A clearer, more accurate framework for understanding why dismissive avoidance, despite its apparent effectiveness during earlier life stages, tends to produce accumulating costs that become increasingly difficult to avoid confronting as time passes. This understanding doesn't require anyone currently loving a dismissive avoidant partner to wait indefinitely for eventual change, nor does it guarantee that change will arrive on any specific timeline, even when it does eventually occur. It simply offers accurate context for a pattern that otherwise remains genuinely confusing, revealing dismissive avoidance not as a stable, sustainable life strategy, but as a pattern that, sooner or later, tends to demand a reckoning its own architecture was originally designed to avoid. There's one final thought worth carrying forward from absolutely everything this exploration has traced throughout, because it applies completely and equally, regardless of exactly where any specific dismissive avoidant currently sits along this typical, if genuinely not universal, trajectory. What eventually happens to the dismissive avoidant across the full, complete arc of an entire lifetime tends to reveal something quietly important about the actual sustainability of any strategy built primarily around protecting oneself from vulnerability, rather than genuinely engaging with it. Distance can be maintained for years, sometimes decades, and it can even appear, for considerable stretches of time, to be working exactly as intended. But the specific kind of connection that dismissive avoidance systematically avoids, deep, sustained, mutual vulnerability, tends to be precisely what most people eventually need most, particularly as life's inevitable difficulties, illness, loss, aging, arrive regardless of how successfully closeness has been avoided up until that point. For anyone who has loved a dismissive avoidant partner and wondered whether their own patience or absence would eventually make any difference, this broader trajectory offers a considerably more complete picture than any single relationship's outcome alone ever could. Whatever happens to any specific dismissive avoidant, whether they eventually reach genuine growth or continue the same pattern until the very end of their life, this understanding was never meant to determine anyone else's healing or timeline. It exists simply to offer clarity, replacing confusion about a pattern that would otherwise remain genuinely difficult to make sense of, with an honest, accurate account of where that pattern, left unaddressed, most reliably tends to lead. That accuracy, once genuinely and fully absorbed, tends to matter far more than any specific prediction about any single dismissive avoidant's individual future, because it allows anyone loving one, or honestly recognizing these exact patterns clearly enough in themselves, to make decisions grounded firmly in reality, rather than in either false, unfounded hope or unnecessarily excessive pessimism. And reality, however genuinely complicated it ultimately turns out to be in each individual case, has always offered considerably more reliable ground to stand on than either extreme ever truly could.